suppose we want to run an experiment. We have some Macy's. Macy's is going to be our focal advertiser. And then we have Red Cross ads. So these Red Cross ads are public service announcements. What we do in the treatment group is we show the Macy's ad, and then in the control group we're going to show some placebo ad or some alternative unrelated ad that shouldn't drive sales at Macy's, presumably. And then what we'll do is compare the purchases between the Macy's folks in the treatment group and the people who are shown the Red Cross ad in the control group. The problem with this is that in order to do the sort of optimal experimental design for power, which is a 50-50 split between the two, we'd have to spend essentially our $15 on treatment group. We have to spend another $15 on the control group. So this leads me to perhaps one of the most important quotes in advertising, which is that I want to spend half my budget on PSAs every time I run a campaign. Said no advertiser ever. And for those of you who've ever tried to partner with an advertiser and tried to get them to run an experiment, inevitably that half gets eroded down to 20%, which then gets eroded to 10%, which then it gets eroded down to 2%. And so the more common thing you see in these, at least in the industry, is everybody wants to show one ad to each control group user and frequency cap it, and then that leads to all other types of terrible ad serving behavior. So the surest way to run a biased experiment is to try to economize on either an uninformative or a biased experiment is to try to economize on your placebo ads. And that's sort of where ghost ads are going to come in. But before we get there, I'm going to speak just briefly about the baseline. So what is the baseline, the counterfactual baseline of not showing ads? Is it showing a Red Cross ad? Is that what advertisers do every time they stop showing ads? No. What they do is they exit the auctions or exit the ad serving queue, and instead an ad like Zappos or Coca-Cola or Disney will fill in the spot instead of the Red Cross ad. So naturally, as you might think, Macy's sells clothing and or shoes included, and so does Zappos. And so what you might find is that there ends up being some sort of business stealing effect, or there's a competitive spillover when you exit the market and stop showing your ads. And so really the right baseline would be what happens when I stop advertising, not what happens when I show a Red Cross ad, which is unrelated. So in these ad systems, what happens is there's an ad log in the treatment group which has the Macy's ad, Starbucks, Toyota, World Wildlife Foundation, and then in the control group we similarly have an ad log. But you notice Macy's name doesn't show up anywhere in there, and we can't actually distinguish where Macy's would have shown up in this ad system unless we actually explicitly decide to record that information. And that's what ghost ads are going to do. Essentially, we're going to be able to record information that will look like Macy's ghost ad in the ad log, and it'll tell us kind of for which each ad that is served whether a Macy's ad would have been served had this user been in Macy's treatment group. So as you can think about this, it's like a very simple concept to implement for a single experiment, but whenever we build these systems, they have to work for thousands or tens of thousands of simultaneous experiments. So if you think every single one of these advertisers could be running their own separate experiment, and they all interact and overlay, and you have to make sure that you're able to log all of that information for every possible experiment that's running. So it turns out that this isn't terribly complicated, and it's also not terribly expensive to do, but it does require careful planning and careful design and good communication with engineers. Yes?
A couple questions. One is, so the control group makes sense in that it's a more natural environment that you face as an advertiser, but it also makes the control group things like time sensitive. So imagine it's Christmas, we're end of quarter, and Zappos ramps up its campaign relative to Macy's at Christmas. Well, then Macy's wants to take that learning into February.
Sure.
But now it's a different environment, whereas PSAs would be the same environment.
That does make sense. So they're the same environment relative to the baseline, but they're not necessarily the same temporal ad effectiveness baseline. So yes, the competitive baseline might be homogeneous over time, but the actual ad effectiveness lift or the actual causal effects of the ad may also be time varying as well.
So that generalizability might be one concern. The second is, in consumer goods markets, I remember there's this large history of test markets for new products. And one thing competitors love to do is figure out when there's a test market so they can screw it up. I mean, is it possible in this context for somebody to write a bot or a scraper and figure out that there's a test market going on for Macy's advertising and then just change their spend to mess up the control group?
Yeah, so there are a couple things that, so I'll speak to that in sort of two ways. First off, knowing exactly who is in the treatment or who is in the control group would be a tantamount to being able to decrypt SHA encryption. So it's essentially the experiment itself is encrypted. That doesn't necessarily mean that a competitor couldn't either jack up, either raise or lower their spend significantly in order to then flood the control group. You know, here it could be Zappos decides to suddenly raise all their bids, and then they win all of the units, or perhaps they see there's an experiment going on, and then they decide to drop out. The challenge with that is that you know, in many environments that could potentially come up if there was, you know, for say that there was a specific web property and the campaign was very simple. But in the world of behavioral advertising, it's very difficult for another advertiser to reverse engineer the entire targeting system to the point that they could really have a meaningful difference. If you happen to be in the exact same market and you buy all the same audiences and the same users and you're using the same ad tech, then the overlap can be quite significant. But what I can tell you from experience, even when you buy through two different partners into the same ad exchange, so Google has an ad exchange called AdX. It's actually very difficult, even if you're trying to buy at the exact same time, to buy the exact same users, not bid in the exact same auctions, but actually buy the exact same users, which is a looser criteria. So in the end, you know, I think that it's something to keep in mind. Especially if these types of experiments grow, because there is opportunity for these types of substitutions. The more important one actually is the advertiser buying kind of competing against themselves. So one thing that can happen is that if Macy's has one campaign that they're experimenting over here, and they have both of the two campaigns that are targeted at the same audience, what can happen is that they end up becoming more likely to win the control group. And so you could, if you had two campaigns that were identically targeted, you might measure no incremental benefit from the other campaign. But part of that is just because you set up your local average treatment effect wrong in terms of estimating it, because you actually had no first stage. You spent the exact same money in the treatment and the control group with the two campaigns, but you thought you were changing it. So there's a kind of a nuance there that comes up in the system here that we built. But again, some of this depends on exactly, can you buy the exact same user at the exact same time? So Google has some deduping methodology that tries to ensure that the same advertiser doesn't compete with itself, and so that's helpful. Facebook also has a product very similar to Conversion Lift, which they call Lift. And their product also has this similar type of challenge. So that is one advantage, I guess, of running PSAs, is that if you bought that inventory, nobody else, including yourself, can buy it, and you know for sure that you didn't show a Macy's ad. The big disadvantage is that it costs you a tremendous amount of money that no advertiser wants to spend. And as a result, you end up with either a low-powered or a very expensive experiment. So the goal here is to lower the cost of experimentation, and in most cases, I think to first order, we actually end up intervening, and we do differentially show ads to the treatment group and don't show them to the control group, and we can quantify how much ad spend went into the control group, how much ad spend went into the treatment group, and then compute a local average treatment effect using the differences in spend, even if there are some of these different spillover problems. Okay, yes, David.
If I understand correctly, the case you described, you would still end up with a treatment difference. You know, there's one other Macy's campaign going on, and what I get to measure is the difference between my campaign number one being there and not being there, knowing that there's a campaign two.
Exactly,
present, right?
exactly. So for example, maybe we spend $1 per user in the treatment group that is eligible for both campaigns, but we only spend 50 cents per user or 75 cents, or maybe even as much as 90 cents in the one that's only eligible for one campaign. So what we'd be measuring is the causal effect of 10 cents in that case, of 90 cents versus $1, even though we thought we were going to be measuring the difference of 50 cents versus $1. And so some of it just, it boils down to keeping track of how much money Macy's actually spent on all the users that you're analyzing in your experiment, which is not a really easy thing to do, to be honest. And so it's not something that's actually currently built into the product. But because of this like low probability of collision, it's probably not a tremendous problem, at least at this point, for most advertisers. It only matters if you're a huge advertiser and have a ton of money and have no coordination or across within Google across all of your ad spend, which does happen for some advertisers, but for most advertisers, there's some coordination. All right. So anyway, the bottom line is that ghost ads is a log entry that flags when an experimental ad would have been served to a user in the control group. So it tells us this information, so then we can compare the Macy's information to the Macy's ghost ad information. All right. So then there's another challenge with PSAs, and this can be resolved through some technologies, but sort of the vanilla way you would try to approach running an experiment is never going to work with with sort of standard technology. So consider an experiment that has two different types of users. We have striped shirt folks and solid shirt folks. Striped shirted people are really fashionable. They like to buy lots of stuff at Macy's. And so generally, we're going to try to show ads to people who are striped shirts. So Macy's, when we actually show the ads, we're able to reach these 6 people. One is solid and 5 stripes. And then there's a bunch of people that we don't show ads to. Some of it's because maybe the targeting algorithm didn't isolate this particular striped shirted person. And maybe sometimes it gets the wrong person up here, somebody who isn't actually into Macy's. And then maybe this person over here just didn't show up today. And so the targeting algorithm worked. It's just, we can't handcuff people to the computer and force them to type in Macy's.com or go visit what pages where they're going to see ads. So a ghost ad experiment would look like this. We want to show Macy's ad, and then we're going to compare the green group here, the people who see the ad, to the people who would have seen the ad based off of the ghost ads. And by so doing, we're able to eliminate all the noise that could come from all these people who don't see the ad. But what happens in a PSA test? This is not that far-fetched, but we sort of illustrate it with an extreme case. So in this case, what we see is that the Red Cross ad does still show the ad to 6 different people. But notice the composition of those users. We show 3 striped-shirted people and 3 solid-shirted people. So now what we've done is we've shown the public service announcement to people who are interested in the Red Cross. The ad systems have tried to adjust targeting to optimize performance of the Red Cross ad with respect to clicks, say. And then the Macy's ad has been optimized to maximize clicks on the Macy's ad. But because the Macy's ad is not the same ad as the Red Cross, the people who are choosing to click on one versus the other are in fact different. And so then the actual ad delivery of the system, due to this feedback, is going to diverge. So the 2 ads are going to reach a different audience. And so then if we were to try to compare the people who see the Macy's ad to the people who see the Red Cross ad, we would convolute a selection effect of the number of striped-shirted people with the actual ad effect of what's the causal effect of showing the Macy's ad on purchases by these people. So perhaps we would overestimate it in this case because striped-shirted people like Macy's more and buy more from Macy's, and when in fact we would be overstating that effect. Okay. Any questions so far? Good. Okay. All right, so now let's consider an alternative. So suppose we decided that as great as PSAs are, that we, 1, don't want to spend the money, and 2, don't trust them because we're in a system that does this type of feedback optimization or sort of click-through optimization. And what we can still do is we can split our traffic. We can take every user in the universe and we can split them in 2, or every user in our target sample. Maybe we were trying to reach these 14 people. And then we split, or 28 people, I guess, and then we split them. What we can then do is we can track the sales among all the people in the control group who were not eligible to see the ads, and can compare it to all 14 people in the treatment group who were eligible. And then essentially we ignore the actual exposure information except to compute the treatment on the treated. So in this, by comparing these 14 people to these 14 people, we get an unbiased estimate of the treatment effect. However, it's also clouded by this extra noise. So there's all these people who didn't see the ad, and what's the treatment effect of not seeing an ad? It's 0. So if there's no ad effect, then there's no difference to be measured. But we still have to include their sales, and it turns out when you add their sales in, it adds variance. And then you're stuck measuring the causal effect with additional noise. So this doesn't look so bad. You might say, hey, Randall, there's only 14 people here. Guess what? This is only a cost of about 30% in terms of power because the ratio of 6 to 8 is not that big. Well, the problem is that in most of these ad targeting systems, sometimes you'll only reach 2% of your audience, and so then it becomes actually a difference in power of about more like 50x. So you would learn 50 times more slowly, or you'd have a 50 times less precise estimate in terms of variance of doing an intent to treat analysis versus say the ideal of having ghost ads. Okay, so in summary, we have that ghost ads are the best of both worlds. We get that they're, one, valid in terms of the counterfactuals, or they're valid, so we get an estimate that measures the causal effects. They're low cost because we don't have to pay for any media anymore. We just have to log a few little records in the system, and then we get the correct baseline by still allowing the other advertisers to participate and show their ads. And then finally we get precise estimates, which is the main advantage of running PSAs, having a placebo to measure who would have been treated, and we get this through the logging. So in the end we have a scientifically valid estimate, and we get all the benefits. So okay, so let's just prove that this actually does work. It's all great in theory, but we've been talking about this theory, David and I, for the last 8 years. So that doesn't mean anything. You got to actually get it done. So here's an example. This is just one advertiser. Just to give you some background. So this system actually operates every day and logs hundreds of millions of ghost ad events currently for hundreds of experiments on any given day for a large number of advertisers. So these are this is just one example. This was, in some sense, the first high-powered example that came through the system in the first month or so of logging this data. And I was really excited about it because we actually had a good partnership with this advertiser, so we could write papers based on their data, which is not always something that we benefit from. So we're going to call this advertiser Sportsing, just for kicks. Those of you who have seen, what's the comic strip from? I
think it's
Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal. Anyway, it's a really great cartoon. So we use there's an inside joke in the paper. So, but it's actually really good. Those of you who are sports fans may enjoy it, or you may hate it. But so anyway, there's a sporting and outdoor goods retailer online. We were able to expose 570,000 users over the course of 2 weeks. We spent $30,000 of their money. We didn't spend it; they spent it. And this was shown on over 500 publishers on the Google Display Network. And we have, for arbitrary bureaucratic reasons, we have a 70% treatment group and a 30% control group. And so again, it would have been ideal. It would have been better. We could have learned for. I'm going to get there. I'm ahead of myself. Anyway, we could have had a better design. But anyway, all right. So bottom line is, we passed randomization checks. Yay! The ghost ads actually, in fact, delivered symmetrically. The first ghost ad that was delivered to each user was symmetric between the treatment and control group. So the first ad that they see versus the first ad that the control group sees, those were in fact symmetric. And we have hundreds of thousands of users here, so these are actually reasonably precise in terms of the actual values. Pre-treatment outcomes, these are also reasonably, basically we don't see it actually took us a year to debug this thing. I had in my SQL queries, I had this terrible inner join that I was doing that should have been an outer join. And so for so long, somehow the ads were actually causing people to buy stuff beforehand. It was a really frustrating experience. It took us an extra year to write this paper because of that.
I watched him every day tearing his hair out for a year at Google.
And it was my fault because I wrote these thousands of lines of terrible SQL, which is not something that an economist should do. But that's how Google works. So, all right. So the bottom line is that retargeting can, in fact, increase sales. So in this case, what we see is that there was a 70% increase in the number of site visits, and then it's 11% or so increase in sales using the ghost ads estimates. And so, a really cool thing is we actually have t-statistics that you can believe in. which is something that's not very common in the ad effectiveness literature when you have a single study and you're trying to measure something for a single advertiser. So in this case, we see that it was about $100,000, $110,000 increase in sales. And just to give you a sense, this retailers' margins are in the range of 30%. So this is about a break even in the short run for this advertiser, which is actually kind of nice to see, because we don't have a whole lot of evidence of profitable advertising either when we actually run these studies. So we have a few of the studies that David and I have run in the past that show some profitability. We have the eBay study, which is kind of like the ultimate counterpoint to effective advertising. And then there's handfuls of other unpublished studies where what we found is that, one, it's hard to track sales in a reliable way, but it's also, in general, when you can't measure something, you can't optimize for it. And then when the first time you measure it, you're probably not going to be doing it optimally. So yeah, eBay is the ultimate case, though, on that, if you've seen that paper. All right. So then we can compare these to the intent to treat estimates. And we see that the relative variance, I think, is probably the most important thing to note here, is that the intent to treat estimates would be about an order of magnitude noisier. So yeah, we did see that with the intent to treat estimate, we have an estimate of 260,000, but I don't trust that one, because that one's not as precisely estimated as the intent to treat estimate, or as the ghost ads estimate. So while we could have convinced ourselves that there was a massive ROI for this campaign, and everybody could have gone home and drunk champagne saying that the ROI was like 500%, we actually have to, this is kind of the problem when you get more power, is that almost always the effect size is converged to 0. Who here has ever run an experiment that had a t-stat of 2.4 and then they got more power and suddenly the effect size got half as big? It seems like every time we run these experiments, this is what happens. But this is a case where we have enough power that we actually trust that that there is in fact a causal effect here, and it's not just due to running a low-powered test. All right, and then we can run a Hausman test to compare these two estimates just to make sure they're the same. And this is so noisy that we actually can't distinguish it from the more precise estimate. Okay. All right. So you have bigger tables in the paper that go over 5 outcomes, which are all interesting, but I'm going to skip them for now. Okay. So now suppose that why do we talk about this being new economics? All right. Good. That's because we could have run this experiment several different ways. So suppose we were in a world where PSAs would have worked. Like we had some clever hack that buys the ad and then randomly flips the creative right at the last minute depending on the user ID. This is something that there's technology to do this, and that would be one way to keep PSA tests legit. So in that case, we would have had to spend another 30% or another 50% essentially over the $30,000 in order to pay for the PSAs, and it would have cost us, and we would have had, that's kind of like the baseline. So we could have spent $45,000 to learn the exact same information here, or holding the same statistical power. Or we run this test this way with $30,000, save ourselves 30%. Or with the exact same power, we could have run a 30-70. We could have just flipped the binomial and paid for 30% of the inventory instead of 70%, and learned that this was in fact a roughly profitable enterprise. But it would only cost us $13,000 to do that. So suppose this was hugely profitable. Well, then we would have regretted not having spent all that money. But we still have the option then to roll out the ads if we do find something that's profitable. But more importantly, if it was a complete bust, we could have saved ourselves the $17,000, discovering that it was a bust, and then we just wouldn't have rolled it out and could have saved our money. So again, having this technology is more about helping improve the exploration process and also the decision making, so that we can not throw money where it's not actually driving true causal effects. Okay. All right. So in conclusion, how do ghost ads improve ad experimentation? Well, first off, they enable cost-effective, high-powered, scalable, on-the-fly ad experiments. All of those things actually matter. The whole on-the-fly part, we can just go and turn the experiment on. If there's a campaign running and we want to run an experiment on it, the advertiser says, I want to learn about it, we just go flip a switch. It's takes 3 minutes and typing a few fields in, and then maybe waiting till midnight if you're for the ad systems to update. But But basically it allows us to run these experiments without all of that tedious setup of like partnering with the charity ad company to get the assets and then negotiating over who's going to pay for what in terms of the PSAs. Just the whole process of doing PSA tests can make experimentation really difficult. The nice thing is it's compatible with all the modern optimization-centric ad platforms, so all the machine learning that's going on in the background. This type of technology is essentially bolted on top and takes all of that as given and still allows us to measure these causal effects. It can easily be applied to all the other types of digital advertising that you might think of, whether it's it's kind of the new TV ads where they're able to deliver a specific commercial to each set-top box that's customized at the household level. That's not very common yet, but we're getting there. YouTube ads are essentially those, and they're covered by this technology. For practitioners, this is really going to be great. It's going to drive ad spend accountability. Nobody likes accountability, though. But for CMOs, maybe this is something exciting, or for CFOs, they'll be excited to see that ads do or do not have any effect. And then for those practitioners that actually want to improve the effectiveness of their ads, they actually will have some technology to then optimize against. So instead of having to optimize for some proxy metric or some imperfect metric, they're able to optimize for the bottom line, which I think is a huge step forward. And then finally, academics, we can learn about advertising by looking at actual causal effects, and we can think about running meta-analyses across many experiments. And so, in particular, we have I'm just going to show you one or two cool pictures. So, like we have pictures like this where we can look at 400 experiments, and we can see this is the lift distribution against particular outcomes that we're looking at, and these are the confidence intervals on each one of the experiments. And so what we can see is that, at least for this batch of experiments, we see that there's a lot of positive treatment effects that are statistically significant. And when you have some of these individually, many of them aren't significant. But when we add them all together, we can actually combine them in a way that allows us to learn interesting things about how long do the effects of ads last, and maybe how does proceeding through the upper funnel versus the lower funnel, how much does that help or hurt the ad lift. So I have a couple other papers on that if you want to look them up on SSRN. One of them's titled, one of them's a ghost ad meta-analysis, and then the other one is called cost per incremental action, kind of pushing a new pricing model instead of like the CPA or CPC pricing model. It's an actual causally motivated one, cost per incremental action. So some of these are in rough format, but I'd appreciate feedback on any of these papers as we push them out to the journal. So, but anyway, thank you.